night may be long and the dark may be deep, but the answers are there to be found. Whether it's the normal, the abnormal, or the paranormal, you're in the right place. Let's go beyond reality.
Tonight, we move to it's not quite the normal. It's not quite the abnormal. It's definitely not the paranormal, but it's disturbing nonetheless. Although the message tonight will be a little more hopeful. And I'm going to warn you right now, there are very few shows where I run the risk of geeking out, but this is going to be one of them. Tonight we're going to be talking to Beatle expert Kenneth Womack, Dr. Kenneth Womack. In fact, he's got a new book out. It's called John Lennon 1980, The Last Days in a Life. And he talks about, in this book, the things John Lennon was doing prior to him being murdered in front of his home on December 8th, 1980. We're almost 40 years from that assassination. In fact, we will be this December. And John Lennon, of course, one of the Beatles. I don't think I have to tell too many people that. A major force in pop music history, rock and roll history, and pop culture history. Not to mention political activism and other things. But this is going to be a very fascinating conversation. And because of the topic, because we'll be talking about the Beatles, because we'll be talking about John Lennon, I am warning you now, I may get a little geeked out. But there we go. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time in this opening segment because I want to get Dr. Kenneth Womack on the program so we can begin the conversation. I will remind you to subscribe in all the great places, YouTube, Twitch, and of course on Facebook. And we'll take a break right now. We'll get Dr. Kenneth Womack on with us. We'll begin the conversation so that I can, in fact, geek out. It's Beyond Reality, and tonight it's all about John Lennon. Hey, everybody, thanks for listening to Beyond Reality Paranormal. I'm your host, J.V. Johnson. I'm going to ask that you support this program. The easiest way to do that, by the way, is if you're listening as a podcast, you just open up the description of the episode and you scroll down to the bottom. And at the bottom, there is a link that says support this podcast. If you click on that, you'll be taken to a page that gives you a couple of options for supporting the show. We greatly appreciate it. It helps us bring great programs to you every week, and we look forward to continuing to do that. And if you're enjoying the program on YouTube, there's another way you can support the show. Just go to the description. You'll see a link to a Patreon page. It's Johaw, Johhaw. And if you go to the Patreon page, you'll be able to pledge an amount to help support the show as well. Once again, thanks for your support. Thank you for listening. Please share it with your friends. You know, there are points in history that burn themselves into the memories of those who've lived through them. There are wars, there are disasters, and of course there are pandemics. But we seem to, despite their seriousness, heal from those and move on, tragic though they are. But one type of tragedy that seems to leave its mark like no other is when we lose someone in a violent or unexpected way, especially in an untimely manner on a national or international stage. I wasn't alive when JFK was assassinated, but clearly that's one of those times. I was alive when it was announced that Elvis Presley had died at the age of 42. And even as a kid, I was affected, and still am, by that day. And then 3 short years later, a moment of similar consequence interrupted the amusement of a Monday night football game when Howard Cosell announced that John Lennon, former Beatle, had been shot and killed in front of his home in New York City. There have been many days where, as the phrase goes, the music has died, but this may have been the most devastating to the greatest number of people. On December 8th, 1980, the serious Beatle, the political activist Beatle, the husband to Yoko Ono, the father of Julian and then later Sean, the writing partner of Paul McCartney, who together penned and performed more hits than anyone before or since. The Beatle, the artist who changed the course of popular music almost single-handedly, of rock and roll almost single-handedly, of pop culture, of politics, and arguably even the human existence, was dead at the hands of an assassin. And what makes this tragedy even more tragic is that it came at a time when John Lennon was on the precipice of being the best he had ever been. And given that he was already a music legend, that says a lot. And tonight we're going to be talking with someone who's not only an expert on the Beatles, but has written a book called John Lennon 1980, The Last Days in a Life, Dr. Kenneth Womack. Ken, welcome to Beyond Reality. I have to tell you, I might geek out a little bit because I'm such a huge Beatles fan. And just looking through your list of credits and the books you've written, we have a lot to talk about tonight.
Well, I'm really glad to be here with you tonight, JB. Thanks for having me.
So there are so many things that we can talk about, but I'd like to get a little bit more about your background. Obviously, you too are a huge Beatles fan. You've written a tremendous amount about them, not just about John Lennon, but about the Beatles as a group. Where did you, and what do you remember of your initial interest in the Beatles that led you to become a fan, very similar to the way I am, it seems?
Well, it was in 1977. I'm like you. I'm not a first-generation fan, and I discovered them when their cartoons preempted my favorite morning show, which was called the New Zoo Review. I was 11 years old, and it was something that I would watch with my much younger brother, over Cheerios. And it was gone. One day, the New Zoo Review was gone, and I think it had just been canceled, and in its place were those old Beatles cartoons from the mid-1960s, and I wasn't impressed with the cartoons. As stories went, they were terrible, but but it was the music that captured me, and I think that's important because that is the one facet of their achievement that will live, and that is those recordings. And John Lennon himself said, why do you want reunions or anything else? The only thing that matters is the music. You will always have this music. And I think he was very prescient in understanding how important that would become.
Obviously, this new book, John Lennon, 1980, The Last Days in a Life, focuses on John Lennon specifically. Did you have an affinity toward John Lennon as your favorite Beatle, if you will, as opposed to any of the others?
No, I didn't. I've never really had a favorite Beatle. I suppose if I started off with maybe a nod in any direction, it was because Paul McCartney was so massive, during the period when I discovered the band. So it was easy to hear him on the radio during that period. But I certainly was, since I started really becoming interested in them in 1977. By the time 1980 rolls around, I was just giddy with excitement about this new album. And I was, by this point, very cognizant of the fact that he hadn't done anything, as it were, in a long time. And so it was a big deal. Let's
talk a little bit about John Lennon from basically 1969, 1970, when the Beatles came apart, broke up. And he made a little bit of music early after that, but then seemed to withdraw from public attention, public life. Walk us through the end of the Beatles through those middle years in the 1970s.
Well, he certainly had, I think, probably in his own mind, something to prove, and he does that right out of the gate with the 1970 release of the Plastic Ono Band album, which, of course, turns 50 this fall, and for many is his crowning achievement. Certainly his most, I guess, confessional sort of work, very sparse, with that kind of Phil Spector sheen to it. Mm-hmm. He would come out with Imagine, which is certainly a more commercial record, and I think has a special place in the hearts of a lot of John Lennon and Beatles fans. And then, of course, you have some ups and downs. You've got the Sometime in New York City album, which has a big heart about activism, and it certainly sees John and Yoko attempting to capture the zeitgeist. The quality, to my mind, and I think a lot of folks, falls slightly behind those first two albums that he christened his post-Beatles life with. But then you have Mind Games, which has a number of very fine cuts. Walls and Bridges is magnificent in many ways. And then his throwback effort with Rock and Roll. But it was a kind of natural time for him to pull back. He'd had that long experience attempting just to stay in the United States, right?
Yeah.
With that long immigration fight. getting his green card. The Apple, their commitment to EMI and their Apple label ended in 1976. And so John, after the Shaved Fish compilation, was without, as it were, a contract. Not that he couldn't have had a new one. In fact, there was a fellow with EMI who, every time he was in New York, would attempt to get John to sign with EMI. And his name was Bob, and John called him Bob Have Mercy, because he just wouldn't let up. Because rightly so, he figured John would come out with new music again someday, and his interest was keeping John with the home label. But I think when we look back on that period retrospectively, it's pretty clear that he needed a break of some kind. I mean, first of all, they were running around the world and just putting all of their energy into the Beatles. But unlike the others, he then has this protracted immigration fight, which just dominates so much of his energy and attention. It had to be draining.
Yeah, he wanted to make New York his home, and I don't know the entire background of this fight, but I do know that Richard Nixon didn't necessarily want him here, and I think even Elvis Presley got involved in that a little bit in some fashion. At least he gave his opinion on it.
Yeah, and it wasn't probably too helpful. John was on the enemies list. By contrast, which was a badge of honor for a lot of folks during that period. But Elvis had gone in and met with the president at one point. So it was a very different kind of experience they were having in the 1970s in more ways than one. But yeah, it really sucked a lot of the life out of him, just having to engage in this fight, not being able to travel to go back to his homeland. It just simply wasn't possible because, of course, if he left the country, getting back in was going to be nigh on impossible. And all of it started, pretty strangely when he was kind of manipulated by other activists into participating in an anti-Nixon rally that he never attended. But he got slapped at that moment. He got slapped with this kind of counterculture connection, and the Nixon administration just wouldn't let it go.
John was known for his political activism. He wrote songs about his political beliefs, things like, even Give Peace a Chance is pretty clear. The message is straightforward. He had the bed-in with Yoko in Amsterdam, and he was obviously someone who cared about politics, or at least peace. How much did that distract him, do you think, from making music? Did that become more of a focus for him in those early 70s years?
I don't know that it distracted him at all, really. I mean, his output was very steady, just like it had been in the Beatles years. I mean, one thing that, and you can see this especially during those first few years after their disbandment, they are continuing to be almost the same level of workaholics they were inside the band. I mean, these guys just didn't know how to do anything but work. And I think most Americans can understand that, right? This kind of, work first and then taking time off later, even though John Lennon would, talk about the deep need to hang out and have time when you could meditate or settle in with a good book or what have you. These guys really worked a lot and would have very continuous levels of product coming out. So I don't know that it distracted. It certainly was something he believed very strongly, and he was very strongly anti-war, right? He burnished those credentials with I Don't Want to Be a Soldier on the Imagine album, and just a number of other songs where, his pacifism was on full display. He wasn't, a violent radical by any stretch. In spite of kind of the thunderous sound of revolution, that just really wasn't his bag. He was for out-and-out peace and human rights, So he takes a lot of time off in the late 70s from everything. But as soon as they get back in the public eye, they're contributing to causes again. And even the week of his murder, he was scheduled to fly out to California to participate in support of a striking union.
You mentioned it in one of the answers to the earlier questions when you talked about the rivalry. That probably had a lot to do with the output as well. When the Beatles broke up, you had John and Paul kind of butting heads, and both of them wanted to prove to the other what they could do on their own. I would imagine anyway, right?
Sure. I mean, I think it was mostly healthy. You know, a lot is made of John's song, How Do You Sleep, on the Imagine album.
Right.
But he very quickly pointed out that really was him looking inward. In fact, a lot of his songs where he would attack people like Dylan or McCartney were really him using straw men to attack himself for what he saw as his own failings. You know, his own inability to rise to the occasion, or make great music. You know, he often second guessed not just his voice and the quality of his voice, but he would also second guess the recordings, and didn't enjoy hearing them. In fact, when they would come on the radio, when he would drive around with his assistant Fred in the very late 1970s and in 1980, he would turn them off because all he could do is think about how they needed to be remade.
Yeah, one of the things he did in the studio quite often was he would double his voice because he felt it was weak. He didn't think he had a great voice, and so he would sing over himself, you know, and that's just a recording technique to kind of fatten the sound of a voice and maybe even hide some sins in the recording process. But he certainly had an amazing voice and one of the most recognizable voices of pop music of all time.
Absolutely. And, you know, he learned very early on from George Martin that he could double track his voice and give it more firmness and power. And, of course, as soon as they were able to develop various kinds of trickery in the studio, courtesy of Jeff Emmerich or Ken Townsend, he was all over it because he wanted to alter the sound of his voice. Even Jack Douglas on the last record would put a little bit of slap echo, so John would sort of lay off the attacks on his own voice. But when you know, I'm sure the Let It Be Naked project from 2003, there's that amazing version of Across the Universe where his voice has no treatment whatsoever, and it's just staggeringly beautiful.
His voice was not only beautiful, but it was haunting in a lot of ways. And the thing that always impressed me about John Lennon, and I think a lot of people go through a Beatles evolution where when you're first introduced, you may be mesmerized by Paul and his melodies and his abilities on the guitar. And then as things get a little more serious, you start to respect what John Lennon was contributing in many ways. And John Lennon had a way to take very simple messages and put them into song lyrics in a very creative way. And make them so much more powerful than the sum of the parts. The whole was so much more powerful.
Well, that's just true of the Beatles anyway. I mean, you know, they truly are. And that's why, going back to your earlier question, I don't have a favorite Beatle. You really need them all. Yeah. And you needed George Martin in that room, too. It was just an amazing collection of people at the very right time, at the very right moment in time, doing something really extraordinary. They are the sum of their parts, all of their parts. You know, when you talk about his voice or Paul's melodies, one of the things that makes them so special is the fact that they really knew how to sing. Yeah. And Lennon and McCartney in particular learned back in those poorly PA amped clubs in Hamburg, they learned how to belt out a tune. And so both of them had lots of amazing voice control. They had vocal control. They knew how to control their voices at different levels of power to sing from the diaphragm. And it makes a lot of the difference in those recordings.
Well, you hear McCartney in songs like I'm Down or even in Hey Jude and how they just belt it out. And, you know, you don't try this at home, folks. You're going to blow a vocal cord here.
Sure. Or a song that I think people have only just begun to love in a larger sense over the last 20 years or so. Hey, Bulldog, when John screams out, you know, if you're lonely, you can talk to me. God. He does that with just extraordinary vocal power. And that makes the song worth it. Just to hear him sing that line it gets the hairs up on the back of your neck.
You just gave me chills by mentioning the title, because that has been, since my introduction to the Beatles, one of my favorite Beatle tracks. It's an amazingly powerful song. Love that song. John had met Yoko Ono in the late 60s, and it changed a lot. And I'd like to get maybe kind of clear the air a little bit. What are your thoughts on Yoko Ono's influence on the end of the Beatles, or the Beatles, her influence on them at all?
I don't know that she has an influence on the end of the band so much. And actually, a Beatles writer, and I know it wasn't a Beatles writer at all. I was talking to Michael DeBar, the fellow who was in the Power Station for a while and had written that great 1980s hit Obsession. And we were talking about that, and he made a great point about her that I just can't get out of my head. And it is that Yoko, as an artist, brought attention to the band that helped shape those last few albums. And I think that's true. I think that's a great way to think about her. She certainly didn't break them up. I find that to be silly. They denied it. She denied it. It was different that she wanted to be with, her boyfriend, then husband, in the studio. And that kind of, I guess, weirded them out by most accounts, particularly George Harrison, who had been, grown up in a very traditional kind of, with gender boundaries in the home, has had a lot of Liverpudlians and a lot of people around the world, right, from the 40s and the 50s. But beyond that, they broke up because the politics were so thick in that band.
Yeah.
They harness their ambition in ways that very young people often don't, right, where they recognized late in 1963 and certainly in 64, when there were no fewer than 3 different television specials devoted to the genius of Lennon and McCartney, and yet they hadn't really done anything yet in terms of the great majesty of their music. So very early on, the stakes of authorship, as I like to describe it, get really high because they realize something. They are doing something that will probably eclipse history. And that's a lot of heavy weight when you're 21, 22, 23 to think about. And because of that, this kind of one-upsmanship begins to take place, certainly between Lennon and McCartney when they're no longer writing together, but they're showing up with songs and trying to get the next single or, break the next record or whatever, it is. And then, of course, here comes George Harrison taking up the rear. And for a while they can ignore him, but after a while, nobody can in the studio because he's just rolling out one gem after another. So the stakes are pretty high inside that band. And then you have the simple fact that you're growing up and you're growing older, and nobody thought rock bands would be something you do when you're 40, right?
Right.
And then secondly, I don't know anybody who really wants to hang out with the guys you knew when you were 16.
Right.
You just don't.
You don't.
Yeah. And they certainly didn't want to.
You mentioned George Martin, and again, this is a bit of an aside, but I've got you here. I've got to ask you these questions. You've written a lot about George Martin's influence in the studio, and for folks that don't know who George Martin is, tell them who he is and how important he was to the Beatles.
But George Martin was a fellow they had to win over. He was, the first producer. He was the A&R head at Parlophone who signed them and ultimately supervised their first session on June 6, 1962. He was not bowled over by them at all. They had a penny per record contract. What they didn't know about this man with this beautiful cut glass, what sounded like an upper-class voice, was that he was actually more impoverished than any of them had been. He was from the wrong side of the tracks, and he was making and remaking himself in London and had been for more than a decade at this point, and he wanted a rock band. He didn't think they were it at first, so they had to win him over, and it was John Lennon who does that in September 1962. When they come back to work on other tracks with him, they've already recorded Love Me Do, and he's consigned to the fact that that's going to be their first single. He's not fond of it other than he likes the harmonica. But what happens is John stands up to him and says, we want to do our own material, and here's this song, Please Please Me. They play a slow version of it, the way it was written, like a Roy Orbison tune. They come back the next week, though, because he had said, well, why didn't you try a faster version of it? Well, they didn't try it because they hadn't thought of it, but they listened to him, and they came back with the faster version, and they knocked his socks off. They really earned his commitment to them, and from that point forward, really, it never wavered. He immediately took the plunge and said, let's make an album. He really helped to guide their career right along with Brian Epstein. It was quite magnificent, this kind of partnership that they had. It was the biggest stroke of luck that they didn't get signed by Decca in January 1962, and they were still available for EMI. So it was just a magnificent stroke of luck that brain trust, 4 people, all from, in their own way, the wrong side of the tracks. Brian had failed at everything he'd ever tried to do. He was a Jewish homosexual living in Liverpool at a time when it was illegal, of course, to be gay. So just absolutely all these outsiders coming together and toppling the record industry.
And George Martin infamously said after the Beatles recorded Please Please Me, the song you just referenced, he said something to the effect of, boys, you just recorded your first #1 hit. And he was right.
That's right. But, the great Beatles writer and a good friend of all of ours, Mark Lewis, was the smart guy who went and found out from the folks who were there what happened next. And it makes the story even more powerful. So George brashly says, you just recorded your first #1. The Beatles fall over laughing. It's ridiculous. It's a preposterous idea that they're going to have a #1 song. They don't even let themselves pretend that that's something that's possible. Now, of course, what makes it a great story is George was right.
Let's talk about John Lennon after his early productivity post-Beatles. He records a bunch of great stuff. Then he kind of starts to pull away. What's happening? We know that Sean Lennon was brought into the world. Was that really much of the motivation for John to remove himself from public eye and from music?
Well, it was certainly important to him to be a father who was visible and present. He rightly carried a lot of guilt over not being there for Julian Lennon, who was born in 1963, during those, the years when they were barnstorming around the world with Beatlemania, and then later when, they became the most eminent studio band of all time and put in 12-hour days perfecting all of those great songs in the late 1960s. So he was very cognizant of the fact that he had not been present, that he could have been a far better father. And this was even made more manifest in the early 1970s when he started to spend time with Julian again. Some of it at the behest of May Pang and later with Yoko. It was pretty clear that he had not been there. So he was determined to be a more present father for Sean. He was very cognizant of the fact that Sean barely made it into the world anyway. It was a very difficult pregnancy. Even on the day of birth, they were having problems, taking care of the mother and the baby. So John was really aware of these sorts of things and wanted to be better. And again, we cannot underscore the fact that he had to have been simply exhausted by making music for all of these years, and also that protracted immigration fight.
Did John withdraw from public life completely during those years? I think there are some interviews. He did kind of try to, once in a while, make an appearance, didn't he?
Sure. In 1975, he was on The Tomorrow Show, with Tom Snyder, and then he would occasionally do a piece here and there. But he certainly had lessened his output. Now, of course, if we go back and look at the record now, you can see that he's popping up here when when his immigration fight is licked, then they can go to Japan, right? They can do those sorts of things. Right. There would be lots of sightings in New York. But the interesting thing about living in New York during that time, and even sort of today, is that, New York tries not to overindulge or out its celebrities. I think it's one of the charms, certainly during that time and even today, that folks in the city they want their privacy too, and and so they sort of respect, celebrities, and there isn't a lot of head turning unless you're talking about the tourists, right? Who, of course, make up a lot of the city's visitors until recently, but it was probably the perfect city for him to try to lower his profile a bit. Now, that didn't stop him from, he and Yoko had a number of favorite restaurants that they would go to. He would take Sean when he was old enough, actually pretty early in his life, to learn how to swim at the Y on the Upper West Side. So it's not like they were hiding out either. He liked to sort of compare himself to Howard Hughes, but he was certainly never reclusive like Howard Hughes was, by any stretch. And they would take these long summer vacations in Tokyo, and they would indulge themselves as they should have. I mean, he had given so much of himself to the world. There were a number of rock critics who thought that was problematic, that he had sort of disappeared in this way and was sort of leaving music to its own devices. But John kind of quietly let it be known that was his prerogative.
Yeah, and he writes about that in some of his music as well. We're talking with Dr. Kenneth Womack tonight. His book is called John Lennon 1980, The Last Days in a Life, but he's got many Beatles books, many other nonfiction books, some novels as well. You can see all of that if you go to his website, which is his name, KennethWomack.com. Ken, talk to me a little bit about drug use and John Lennon. We know that, he had his episodes and had his issues. Did that last to the end of his life that we know of?
I don't really spend a lot of time on that because I wanted to write a book that was more about how he lived and how he brought these great songs into existence. Mm-hmm. And others have sort of worked in that territory. And so I don't spend a lot of time on that. I do address a moment that he brings up in his audio diary that he was working on in late 1979. He had a relapse with heroin and really chided himself over it. It wasn't even something very extended, but the fact that it happened really bothered him. And Yoko had her own relapse in early 1980 that she was embarrassed about, but has been very open about in her own interviews over the years. But beyond that, I think it was predictably recreational. I don't think they were having the kinds of issues that they did in the early 1970s. Others have written differently. Most notably, Goldman in his book "The Lives of John Lennon," which came out in the 1980s. But I didn't want to write a book that was about drugs. I wanted to write a book about how these songs came into existence in the nick of time. Now, as I said, when he says something in a diary, then it's going to be impactful in terms of his mind. He would also complain, though, about, having sexual urges or other things that he would chide himself over that might be getting in the way of his creative life or his artistic life or even his reading. One thing I wish we had more of that I try to cover as much as I can is a sense of his library. What was in John's library? We know from his lists that he would give to his assistant Fred that, he was reading a lot of nonfiction. And we know he was a voracious reader, and he was very much in tune with what was going on from high to low culture, right? He, like us, he watched Saturday Night Live. He watched One Day at a Time, lots of schlocky TV. He saw it. He was a great watcher of television. I find that charming because we all were.
Yeah, he liked TV. I mean, he was a TV watcher.
Absolutely. And, he was a great observer of culture. And if you're going to do that, you turn on the television and you see what's happening. And that's what he would do. He was very in tune with what was happening. He often had the sound turned down on the television and he would have music playing quietly in the background, and he read and read and read. He read lots of magazines. He read the newspapers every day, and I said newspapers, plural. He read all of the latest nonfiction. He particularly was interested in travel literature, literature of the sea. One of his favorite books was Kon-Tiki, which he read several times. So he had a very wide, high and low cultural life, I guess, as it were. But what I love about that is it just reminds us how human he is, right? How human he is like us. There's a great little version of Watching the Wheels. He tried it out in many different modes and with many different arrangements until he finally found the one that we know and that he liked. And one of them was sort of an old Revolution-like version on his guitar where he's singing it kind of up-tempo. But when it runs out of steam at the end, he just starts talking about the captain and Tennille, and that's what we were doing too, right? He liked the Little River Band. Guess what? So did we, right?
Wow.
This was part of our culture. He heard Heart of Glass and was mesmerized by this great new sound and, rattled off a postcard to Ringo that maybe he should try to get a hit again by doing something like that.
We need to talk a little bit about how the songs, I'm not sure where to start here. Double Fantasy, obviously, was John's last album, and it was the record that was in the hands of his later assassin the night that he was killed. But those songs are really important, and they were the basically John Lennon reintroducing himself to the music world. But a lot of that music is a result of John being away from Yoko, isn't it? Let's talk a little bit about the Lost Weekend and how that actually ultimately led to the writing of many of these songs and what became Double Fantasy.
Sure. So a couple of the songs do have their roots in the period in which he was with May Pang. May remembers the melody, at least of John's acoustic guitar, which had a kind of Asian flavor to it for Beautiful Boy. She remembers John, sort of perking up when they were watching, I think it was Chinese soap operas at one point. And there are a number of songs from that period, right, that have that flavor, like Number 9 Dream, for example. Mm-hmm. So you can sort of hear that. But then a number of them he starts working on around 1976, 77. One of the misnomers, and there are several that I was interested in exploring, but one of them was that those songs had been written in Bermuda in the summer of 1980, and it was this big fusillade of songs. I think that was shorthand that John and Yoko were using just to get through that whole spate of interviews they were doing in August, September, October, November, December, those last months in 1980. I just named them all. I should have just said the fall of 1980. Anyway, I think it was shorthand, really, just to explain that, they had finished a lot of the songs, and he in particular had sort of wrapped them up during that trip. But they had been around for quite a long time, and this is consistent, as you know, with how he wrote music anyway. He was a great grafter, if you will, and drafter of different pieces, and he would bring them all together. And they often would be spurred on by found objects out in the world. A Day in the Life is a couple of newspaper articles, right? Happiness is a Warm Gun is an article John showed him, and a cartoon by Peanuts. These kind of things would stick in his mind, and they would become part of his song. A poem that he read by, I think it was Milton Hayes, ends up being Nobody Told Me, or his own, witnessing with May of a UFO outside their balcony at their apartment. So he was very good at weaving in the objects and language of the world into his songs, and that meant he would draft lots of different fragments. And so he would keep these around in his bag. He had, lots of tapes and song fragments and ideas that he would jot down, and they would start to pun intended, come together into these different pieces. And what we really see is that he's working on these sporadically until the late 1970s, and the energy starts to perk up. I mean, I think they must have known by late 1979 that something was going to happen for them in 1980 because their energy was back. And Yoko had been a great helper. You know, you asked about her earlier. She'd been a great spouse in the sense that, you know, she had supported him when he was starting to work again. She went to Manny's Music, that great store that used to be in the, you know, at Midtown, that great music store, and purchased for John this very state-of-the-art Yamaha keyboard, and had it installed. And in fact, it excited John so much, he went to the store in person and got that Hummingbird acoustic guitar that would be very influential for him, along with his Ovation in the late 70s. So, you know, she helped stir in that energy because she could tell that otherwise, if left to his own devices, he might not leave his room and share those songs. He needed, you know, as George Harrison once said, some people need somebody to help spur them on. And for him, that was Yoko. And so she really helped him get to that place where he was starting to feel confident again.
Do we know, in retrospect, was he proud of the work he did on Double Fantasy?
I think so. And, you know, he should have been, because when you just look at that record by itself, look at his contributions, right?
Yeah.
You know, you've got Starting Over, Watching the Wheels, Woman, Beautiful Boy, Cleanup Time, and, of course, one last great song for Yoko, right, on that record. They're all exceedingly well made. Jack was the right guy, Jack Douglas, to produce that album, and he did a splendid job on it, you know, in doing his best George Martin, whom he admired very much and knew already at that time. So Jack had a really strong sense, having worked with John and Yoko before, how to help them get something down on tape that they would be proud of and happy with. There's a great moment that I was sure to have in the book, that just brings a tear to my... I choke up when I think about it. It was, you know, he only lived for a couple of weeks with that album available in stores.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, even more distressing, really, when you think about it. But Yoko had come to him during those final couple of weeks, and she knew how important it was for him to put these new songs out in the world and, you know, get the old magic back. That had to be in their world, and you can see it. He was talking to his relatives back in England, his half-sister Julia, for example, about coming back and you know, making that trip finally to see his Aunt Mimi and all the relatives, to go up north to there's an ancestral family home that they wanted to get together in. And John was excited. He kind of wanted a number one no in his back pocket so he could come back, you know, with the ticker tape parade. Who can blame him? And Yoko was realizing that while it was selling and they were promised, they already knew it, they would have gold records soon from David Geffen, but it wasn't going as quickly as they thought it would. And there are good reasons for that we can talk about, but they had this moment. They're in the sitting room up there in apartment 72 in the Dakota, and Yoko is sort of saying, I'm sorry, it's going kind of slow. It's selling, but, you know, she was trying to sort of, I guess, temper his expectations.
Yeah. And
John did what a great spouse does. He let her off the hook. He said, you know what? That's okay. We have the family.
Wow.
And I love that story because it just tells you so much about, in shorthand, where he was during those last few weeks. And, of course, he was about to really get excited about walking on thin ice.
The music scene in 1980, I mean, if we think back, I think the Bee Gees were probably one of the top acts at that point. And, you know, John Lennon didn't create a disco album.
No, and you just took the words, and I'm glad you did, right out of my mouth. It was an intensely competitive time. I mean, what we came to call dinosaurs later are out. Elton John's back. McCartney is, you know, I mean, he has a number one song in 1980, right? You know, you've got all these these stalwarts. But then you've got new wave and punk's jostling for attention. Disco, by 1980 has, people are no longer burning disco records. It has earned its place in the firmament. You have on the horizon a new British invasion coming. So it is an intensely competitive landscape. And there was the appropriate buzz for a new John Lennon album, but it was slow. And while he decided to tour, he wasn't doing it right away, right? He was going to do it in 1981. And a lot of bands had learned by this point that if you wanted to see something happen in real time, you had to be on the road.
Was John, when Double Fantasy was released, the critic response was a little less than favorable in many venues, wasn't it?
When you look back, it certainly was. I mean, 14-year-old me loved the album. Right. I loved Yoko's songs on the album. I was so happy. I displayed it the day I got it in November 1980, which must have been the day it was released. I bought it at Target, and I remember vividly sort of placing it on my mantle and sort of, in my bedroom and sort of, displaying it just as I'd done when I got the single a few weeks earlier. And, I was excited. A lot of my friends were excited. It was in heavy rotation, certainly just like Starting Over was on the radio. But yeah, I mean, it didn't feel cool like a lot of critics probably wanted it to in 1980, right? There was a sort of muscular way that critics wrote, both more brutally in the UK and certainly in places like Rolling Stone at the time. And it just came off as a guy who is about to turn 40 and wants to write about his family and things he's discovered about himself. It probably didn't feel cool to the kind of rock literary set. No, it didn't feel cool to the rock literary set. People who were 40 identified with it, and or in my case, 14, right? Identified with it, and it meant something to them. I was just happy to have a John Lennon record happening after I discovered the Beatles. So it was a big deal, right? The same way that I bought Coming Up the day it came out, So those were big moments for folks. He was not getting great write-ups. Yoko, ironically, was getting some good ink because she kind of sounded new wave in those songs, or even daring, right? With Kiss, Kiss, Kiss. Every Man Has a Woman Who Loves Him really sounded au courant and contemporary, whereas John kind of sounded, in a phrase that's become far more tired since his passing, Beatlesque.
To quote John Lennon, life begins at 40, and John was 40 when he died and when that album came out. I love the reference in the title, Ken, about John's song, A Day in the Life. I mean, that's obviously what you did there. Tell us a little bit about how you came up with that.
Well, I wanted to make sure it was something that wasn't, I didn't want to point too overtly to his murder. The book is not about his murder. It's
right.
Not a true crime book. I don't depict that in any sense other than he walks into an archway and the lights go out for all intents and purposes, right? Mm-hmm. But A Day in the Life to me is, it may not be your favorite Beatles song. It's many people's favorite Beatles song, but it's probably the most luminous and most important. Because of the fact that it pushed them forward. It was like the Beatles on the Millennium Falcon going into hyperspace, right? Yeah. It's just an amazing moment. And it was him, I believe, in 1980 doing what we all, if we don't know our number's up, but our number is up, coming up, to take one last stab at greatness. And, regardless of what the critics say, it is a consensus great record, and it should be. And it is a guy, barely, he was 40 for how long?
His birthday's October, right? October.
Yeah, 50. He's not even 40 for 60 days.
Yeah.
Right? And yet goes out sort of like the Tempest, right, at the height of his powers. And And there were other things, of course, we didn't even know about at the time that were going to come to us, like Rolled With Me and Nobody Told Me and these other wonderful songs.
Talk about the Dakota a little bit. Obviously, we know that's where he was shot, but he lived there. Yoko still lives there. The Dakota was kind of an important part of his life, particularly in New York City.
Oh, they had chosen it, very carefully as the place they wanted to live. They had sublet actor Robert Ryan's place, and then began buying up apartments. A lot is made about the fact that they accumulated so many different spaces in that building. But when I'm asked about that, I point people to Bruce Springsteen or Paul McCartney, who have warehouses full of stuff.
That's right. Yeah.
Because they've been in public life and they've been on tours and they accumulate so much. John had, dozens of guitars, for example, and they needed space, and they were getting more stuff all the time, some of it because they would accumulate souvenirs from their travels, but also simply because, the Beatles had gold records coming in all throughout the 70s, and other kinds of material.
And the Dakota itself is just a beautiful building. I mean, architecturally, it's very unique. And if anybody's seen the film Rosemary's Baby, you're probably familiar with the fact that it was filmed there. But it's kind of almost the setting of a horror movie, despite Rosemary's Baby, in its look. It's just got that dominating look to it.
It does. It was completed in 1886, so it's one of the older addresses in New York City. It was built to attract people along the future Central Park to the Upper West Side before it was even remotely fashionable. That's why it was called the Dakota. It was so far away from everything that was happening, it might as well have been in the Dakotas, which were a territory right at that point.
Yeah.
So it was it is a very august address. It was in a kind of a period of transition when they started to buy up apartments there, because it used to be a sort of artsy kind of bohemian place, which the West Side was. But it was starting, of course, to go up in price, and of course now is only available to folks with very great means, when an apartment goes on sale. I mean, they bought theirs for double-digit thousands, and now they're double-digit millions.
Right.
So, if anything, it's actually surpassed the rate of growth in the city in terms of, being able to find affordable housing. So it's an esteemed address that mattered to them. It also mattered, they left down in the Village is where they lived before on Bank Street, which, remember, New York in the 70s, and a lot of what my book is about is New York in the 70s and into 1980, was a very different place. It wasn't the same. It was a tourist mecca, but in a very different way. It still had a gritty, sort of seedy side to it. It likes to pretend that it does now, but, it is just living there is expensive, and that creates certain kinds of fiscal restrictions, financial restrictions. So it's an extremely different place. I make sure that early on I have the image from the Dakota, this august address. One of John's neighbors, I think on the 5th floor below him, is looking out toward the park, and he sees this family, and they're coming together to have a barbecue, right? Like you might have done today.
Mm-hmm.
And they're sitting at a park bench, and they're at one of those. They start working on their barbecue pit, and then they began to hack up the park bench to use as firewood. This was the park was it was a rustic place, but it was also a place you didn't go as soon as it was dusk, right?
Yeah.
It was that people. In fact, John and Yoko participated in a big cleanup in 79 or 80, where everybody from the Dakota went and cleaned up that little part that is now Strawberry Field, but that was sort of like their front yard, right? And they cleaned it up, and they looked out the next morning, and all the garbage was back, right? It was a different world in its own way.
As you put this book together and researched it, what'd you learn about the Lennon's neighbors in the Dakota? Were they respected there?
Well, I mean, there were a lot of people who were simply excited that they were there, and one of the most important adherents of John and Yoko was Leonard Bernstein, who was one of the very early fans and who came from high culture, right? I mean, you don't get any more esteemed than him. He led the Philharmonic at that point in the mid '60s, right? He was coming off of West Side Story. This is a true cultural star in the United States and abroad, and he was a very early fan of the Beatles, and to be able to live near John Lennon was a magical thing to him and his family. His daughters remember one of the last potlucks. They'd have a potluck every fall in the courtyard, and everybody would bring something to share and just hang out together. And John and Yoko would usually bring sushi, and they would all hang out there. And as Sean got older, it was sort of a family thing. And one of these potlucks in the fall, the Bernsteins sang "The Moldy Moldy Man" from one of John's collections of witticisms, and they just charmed him to death. He loved it. So a lot of people were happy about it. Others famously were kind of annoyed by the fans who would congregate. Lauren Bacall did not like them. She, a good friend of mine, remembers watching her in front of the Dakota bark at some of the people for being there, and she sounded just like her commercials at the time for the New York Times. She would, in this stentorian voice, she would sort of, get out of the way. Don't you have something better to do? So, not everybody was a fan of it, as you might imagine. In fact, they would congregate around the front door. So it was a secure building in most senses, although we have to remember and this is one of the reasons, again, I concentrate on New York and that period so much in the book, is because it was a different time, right? The fear was not that somebody would come kill you. Mm-hmm. The fear for them was that somebody would kidnap Sean, right? Mm-hmm. That was the number one concern. The FBI, that was what they would warn famous people and celebrities about. There weren't a lot of examples of their own safety being compromised. The issue was they're going to kidnap, some of your offspring, and we'll be lucky if they survive. There's going to be ransom. By the same token, of course, the big crime that caught so much of our attention in the 1970s was hijacking.
That's right, yeah.
So those were the fears. Not that anybody was ultimately going to get killed, but that there were going to be incidents and ransoms and demands and those sorts of things. So, that was the fear. And the Dakota seemed like a pretty safe place. People could still get in. A couple of the neighbors got really bothered when teens would get in and run up and down the halls looking for John. And of course, in some notable incidents, people would impersonate, in one case, it was actually Paul Gorish who took a number of our important photos of John from 1980, who first came into the building by pretending to be a cable TV repairman, and, they would often have one doorman and maybe a concierge on duty, and it's not, in a rush, you can get by those guys if they're busy. I was pulling up to do a bit of a walking tour just around the neighborhood to make sure I had all my bearings right, and some of the places that I write about that are no longer there, that I had those addresses correct. So I was in a hurry, and I took a cab from Penn Station up to the Dakota, and it went up right up, Central Park West, made the left turn. As my cab pulled up, the doorman left his station to come open my door, and as I tipped him, I thought, what are you doing?
And that was much later than 1980, I imagine. And that was
right, and I wasn't even really going there. I just said I was meeting some folks at the corner.
But you mentioned Paul Gorish, and you said he took some important photographs. He took the infamous photograph of John Lennon signing Chapman's Double Fantasy album, right?
Correct. He took that photo and a number of others. He took the really beautiful shot. I think his best photo, in terms of aesthetics, is the one that's on the cover of the Watching the Wheels single. My God, what a photograph. I was talking about it last week with Roger Farrington, who was there that same day to follow John and Yoko into the studio for the first time. It was August 7th, 1980. And when that happened, Roger was taking his own very good shots in black and white, and he watched Gorish take that photo. In fact, Gorish took a photo of Farrington, changing film or something at the same time. And that is a magnificent photograph of John and Yoko coming out of the archway. But yeah, he also takes the really infamous photo that, I can't stand what it symbolizes.
Yeah.
But John just looks great.
Yeah.
He just is in the prime of life, really, in so many ways. He's healthy. He just looks absolutely wonderful, and just he was buoyant that day. They just finished, and they were in the throes of finishing this amazing recording.
It's unreal. Let's talk about Paul McCartney a little bit. Much has been made about the feuds between John and Paul. We kind of touched on it earlier. However, what do we know about the final years of their relationship?
I think John, fortunately for us, made sure it was pretty emphatic, really. You can see it on the internet. There was a word association quiz he had taken, and they had a bunch of names of people, and they showed him Paul McCartney, and he, without blinking, he said extraordinary. He lumped all sorts of praise on Paul for the McCartney 2 album, and he liked the sped up, Vera-speeded version of Coming Up. He made no bones about it. He loved it. He told his assistant, "It's driving me crackers." He just couldn't get out of his head. Crackers in a good way. And, I think any issues that ever existed, that two friends who know each other a long time would have, by the way, right, would have friction, was simply gone. And he says that very emphatically on his his second to last car ride, when he rides with RKO Radio's Dave Sholin to the studio, hitches a ride with him after signing that autograph. And Dave, I spoke to him about it a couple months ago just to confirm it, and he said, yeah, he wanted to see. He hadn't really asked about Paul, so he said, hey, how are things with Paul? Sort of thinking he could get a scoop or something, right? And John did not miss a beat. He said, I love him. He loves me. I would do anything for him, and I think he would do anything for me, and put a big, giant period on it. Mm. And I imagine Paul McCartney takes great solace, as he should and deservedly does. So from John just really underlining that with a big magic marker, This is where we stand.
Was there any truth?
Powerful.
Was there any truth to the fact that Paul would stop by the Dakota and visit with a guitar, and how did that go?
So a lot of people write about this, and as you know, there's a lot of side taking. Are you a John guy or a Paul guy? And which I find infinitely frustrating because, even though they would sometimes talk about their differences in personality, they're just about the same guy. They're two guys born a mile apart. They grew up a mile apart in a homogeneous shipbuilding town, in the 1940s and 1950s. So their mindsets are not very different. Anyway, but a lot is made about, John turning Paul away. It was Paul coming over a lot, and John had a 1-year-old newborn, and Paul was on vacation. It was April in 1976. They were on hiatus before Wings picked up again in May. Wings is the biggest band in the world that month, and Paul, I think, Silly Love Songs is probably number one, as is the Wings Speed of Sound album. Mm-hmm. And Paul is in town, and he wants to see John. And they famously watch Saturday Night Live together, and the next day Paul comes back, and John turns him away. I think that it probably only happened a few times. Paul doesn't really see him again much after that, if at all. They do talk on the phone. And they would occasionally talk business. There'd be a Beatles reunion story that they felt like they wanted to suss out together before they would talk about it.
Did they ever come close to doing that quote unquote reunion? Did that ever become a almost event?
Well, it certainly did in April 1976. I mean, by both accounts, they were ready to jump in the car and make the short trip to 30 Rock and have a laugh and mess around with with Lorne Michaels and that sort of thing. So that was a real possibility. As far as the other reunions go, there would have been one at Eric Clapton's wedding in 1979 if they'd bothered to invite John. There's still a certain level of mystery about how that invitation didn't go out. So that would have happened. But I think it was becoming inevitable. The money was enormous. As you know, by 79, it was getting very close, if it hadn't already, to being a full $1 billion.
Wow.
And $1 billion in 1980 was a very different kind of $1 billion, right?
Yeah.
Well, it was an enormous amount of money. And to be able to do one concert and to bring those kind of dollars home for charity, I mean, how do you not do that? I'm very sad, and I think will always be, as we all will, about why they don't do that, because John is murdered. But at the same time, he would kind of quash those stories by saying, people want them to get together, and there's part of him that probably did. But what he would say is, it won't be the same band, because it can't.
Right.
10 years have rolled by. They're not the same people. We'll never know, but of course, a lot of the power of the Beatles story comes from a very significant level of mystique. When they walk out of that studio and walk across the road in August 1969, they really don't come back.
Yep.
They have a photo session on August 22nd, and that's it.
Do you think Abbey Road, which was the last album recorded, not the last album released, was their best work?
I don't know. That's such a tough question, right? I mean, can you imagine? I think Revolver's the turning point, if not Yesterday the song, at least for George Martin and what he could see happening with the band. But Rubber Soul is that big turning point. Then you've got Revolver coming up right behind it, and Sgt. Pepper and the White Album. I mean, all of these are indispensable. I mean, so is Let It Be, right? How could you not have those records? They're just amazing. It's like, they're like a great novelist and, or Shakespeare. How do you pick, The Tempest over Lear, or, you need them all. And we have the great benefit of having them all. They certainly go out on a high point, though, without a doubt. They're as good as they ever were.
Hey, have you seen the movie that came out a few years ago called Yesterday?
I have.
What did you think of that film? Just quickly.
I thought it was all right, but I love the idea. The problem is, I'm just going to be a film critic for a minute, so I will change my voice. And my thumb is slightly down on it because I thought the romantic relationship was really poorly done. It kind of there wasn't a romantic intensity, particularly on the guy's part. I mean, they just didn't capture that thing that some leading stars do.
Yeah.
And because of that, and because we don't have the energy, that scene at the end, spoiler alert, where John Lennon, if you do the math on A World Without Beatles, is not dead.
That's right.
And that scene should have had all of us in a puddle of our own tears in the theater. And the payoff didn't work in the way it could have, to my mind. But I know others who did find themselves in a puddle of tears, so maybe I'm just jealous of them.
Well,
but
I happen to,
go ahead.
I was going to say, I happen to agree with you. I felt it fell a little bit short on a lot of levels. But the one thing that really struck me, and you mentioned it, and you made me think of it when you mentioned the Let It Be album, was that songwriting competition that he does, the main character does with, and I can't remember the name of the pop star that actually produced the film, but he's in the film. You probably know the guy's name.
Oh, Ed Sheeran.
Ed Sheeran. Yeah. And they do an on-the-spot songwriting competition, and of course, the main character in the film has the benefit of all the Beatles songs in his head that no one else knows about, and he plays, I think it was Long and Winding Road, right?
Was it that or Hey Jude? I can't remember.
I think it was Long.
It was amazing.
Yeah, and that was a poignant moment to me to illustrate the power and the quality of the songs the Beatles made.
Absolutely. And, the thing that I am, and I'll stop writing books about them when I'm cured of this, but the thing that endlessly excites me about them and their story is they start with Love Me Do and they end with Abbey Road. That is a journey like no other.
Right.
Including the January 1969 songs that become Let It Be. That's part of that journey. What an amazing artistic ride. Shakespeare doesn't do that. James Joyce doesn't have that same level of, it's an incredible level of quality. And as you said, it's increasing power as they go through and they're able to do this. And the fact that they stuck it out for so long, I think owes a lot to the very point that you just made, because the music was so good. They knew that they needed to do it anyway. It was bigger than them. There's that great moment hopefully we'll see in Peter Jackson's film, right? Where George is, he's left the band and he's come back and he kind of touches his heart and he says, "Heart of hearts, I should be here with you guys." Mm-hmm. Even though they're driving him nuts, right? Yeah. He realizes that what they're doing is bigger than they are.
And not only did they progress from Love Me Do to Abbey Road, they pulled the world with them. All of music progressed with them as they made that progression. And the number of artists that heard the Beatles, whether it was on Ed Sullivan or wherever they were introduced, who became sensations themselves, but inspired by those early glimpses of the Beatles on television or hearing their records on the radio, that is a universe unto itself.
Absolutely. And, going back to the film, if there's another failing, and I guess it can't be helped when you've built a high concept like that, it's that the songs, of course, don't appear in order. And what makes them exciting and interesting is, the same band in July 1963 that works on She Loves You, 4 years later is doing All You Need Is Love and I Am the Walrus. That in itself is hurtling through space and time at an unholy rate of growth. That to me, that's what fascinates me about them is how they get there. And even with John Lennon's story, which is obviously unfinished, but he emerges on a new plane of existence with a whole batch of new songs that don't sound like what he was doing when he left.
On December 8th, the day that John Lennon was shot and killed, before he went to the studio, I believe, he took some pictures for Rolling Stone magazine. They're pretty poignant pictures, but tell us, in your estimation, what they tell us about John Lennon in 1980 at that moment.
Well, they tell you a number of things. One, he still had that ability to shock, right? Annie Leibovitz had got the cover assignment. John was supposed to be on the cover. John had warned her that he wanted a cover shot that had Yoko too, despite what Jan Wenner might or might not have wanted. And so he cooked up this idea of doing a naked cover with her. She wasn't into being naked, and so he did it for her, and he wraps himself around her. And apparently said, "You captured our relationship perfectly," with him sort of wrapping himself around Yoko for all his might. And sure enough, that was the cover shot, right? But it said a lot about where he was at in his marriage, in the sense that he really wanted Yoko to get her due. And he knew that she had recorded a number of great songs for Double Fantasy, and even before that. She has a couple of really sensational underplayed albums from the early 70s. Approximately Infinite Universe is a good example for the folks out there. But he really wanted her to get her due. And he was so excited because, to his ears, The song that was going to change all of the trajectory of John and Yoko was Walking on Thin Ice. In fact, that night, when they're listening to the playbacks and preparing to go to the mastering studio the next day, John said, "This is the direction." And I love that, because here's this guy who has been showing us the direction for years, right? And blazing new progressive paths in music. And on the very last night of his life, he's saying, "This is the direction," as though he's just found it for the first time.
Wow. Do you think Yoko Ono has represented John Lennon and all of his accomplishments well in the years since his death?
I think so, on balance. First of all, it's an unwinnable, untenable situation. All sorts of things break apart that night. Not just the terrible tragedy of John being murdered and the loss for Yoko and Julian and Sean, but also all the people who worked with him and knew them, with whom he'd made plans. I mean, these worlds just split apart and collide, and lots of lives are just tarnished and reoriented. I think she's done a pretty damn good job, all in all, of being respectful of his memory and trying to negotiate through what was a very difficult time in the 80s as the Beatles tried to sort out their business interests. That was a very difficult time, with a number of new lawsuits that were emerging that they had to clear up so that they could get to the 90s and circle the wagons again and make the anthology. So I think she's done, on balance, as good a job as she could in what are just frightfully awful circumstances that don't get better, right? I mean, it's a loss that I think actually becomes and feels more acute year after year. So I think she, to my mind, she does a really excellent job under the circumstances. Are there missteps? Sure, occasionally. Both she and Paul will make them too, right?
Yeah.
In terms of the legacy, simply because all of this stuff is so much bigger than just, a few human beings. And I can't imagine the pressure that must exist even now, when she's 87 and trying to get this right, and trying to honor his memory and honor her son and her stepson and all of these things. That's just got to be tough. And plus, everybody's watching.
Yeah, everybody's watching. Recently, and you probably remember the title, there was a new documentary released, and a lot of it was showing footage of John recording Imagine. And I'm trying to remember what the title of it was. I felt like that particular documentary was a little bit of a greater effort, and probably because it was orchestrated by Yoko, but to demonstrate her involvement and how important she was in John's, not just his personal life, but his musical life.
Right. And, to a certain extent, she's entitled to, right?
Absolutely.
Mean, I know there was a lot of, there was some backlash when, she asserted co-authorship of Imagine, but all you have to do is you can listen to the interview where John says, I should have given her co-author credit.
Right.
If I were a bigger person, or I forgot exactly how he phrased it, I would have, because, of course, he drew it directly from her Grapefruit book and her poem, or her, what did she call those? There was a wonderful term she had for them, for her little one-off poems that are so poignant that I will not remember in time for our guests tonight, our audience. But anyway, so she's entitled to a certain extent to do that, of course. But I'm reminded about something I learned in graduate school. I think it's really important. A lot of the best historical work is going to be done 20, 30 years from now.
Right.
Mark Lewison is doing amazing things on telling those early years, the narrative of the Beatles' early years, and he's about to, in a few years, move into the midsection of their career. And he's doing it now when many of the principals are dead.
Right.
That's because you can sort of look with an unvarnished lens. That's a weird metaphor I just created. But you can sort of look at that world and you're not having to keep score anymore, right? You're not having to worry about what this person thinks or that person thinks. And a lot of the best history is written, as the decades go on. You'd think it would be different, right? It would be closer to the subjects being alive, but there are a lot of really excellent examples of biographical works about huge historical figures that are done better later because you're not trying to satisfy people who are alive and holding sway, for lack of a better word in the world.
The book is called John Lennon 1980, The Last Days in the Life. What do you hope people walk away from the book with after they've read the last page?
I hope that that they feel like I still do, like 14-year-old me I would love to have read that book at 14, because it the tragedies there, what he went through to get to the place to make music again. And, when you're writing a book and you're reading a book, it has the feeling of real time. And I hope people feel the power and the majesty of that. And I gave Sean Lennon the last word. I think in a way that at least it's moving for me. So I hope people feel the poignancy. And 40 years later, while we'll never get over what happened, and I mean we in the biggest sense, okay? Because while you and I have been talking, hundreds of kids around the world, probably thousands, have discovered the Beatles.
Right.
And what a wonderful thing to do. Aren't you jealous of them in a way? So they've made this discovery. It's going to change their lives, but eventually they're going to read that Wikipedia article and they're going to find out what happened to John Lennon. And it's going to break their heart too. And this reminds us of so many to me, I hope it reminds folks of the wonderful things that he and Yoko accomplished together and that John sort of checked off his list. And even that last night, right? This is the direction. Yeah. Who doesn't want that for the people they love in their lives to still be energized, even though there's something out there that's about to wrench them out of the world? I think that's powerful and inspiring, and you can hear it in my voice. I'm inspired talking about it.
Ken, it's been a terrific hour and a few minutes here, and thank you so much for sharing all of the work that you've done with us, whether it's this book or any of the others. It's tremendous work, and it touches a real place in my heart, and I know I'm not the only one. There are millions of people like me who appreciate all you've done.
Oh, well, thanks so much, and it's just been a great joy to speak with you tonight and talk about these things, so I thank you.
Beyond Reality Paranormal is hosted by J.V. Johnson and produced by Orion Palmer and Slick Eddie Edwards. Like us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please consider supporting the program either through your podcast platform, click on the link in the description, or on Patreon at Joha Productions. If you'd like to be a guest on Beyond Reality Paranormal, or you have a recommendation for a guest, contact our producer, Slick Eddie Edwards. Eddie is spelled with a Y at slickeddieedwards@gmail.com.